When the Taliban rose to power, many hoped life might finally feel safe. But almost immediately, a new kind of terror began aimed directly at women. Streets, markets, and even stadiums became stages for punishment. The cruelty of what happened left scars that still haunt the country today. The Taliban entered Kabul in 1996 after years of civil war had already exhausted the country. For women, life changed in a single day. Girls were told they could no longer go to school, no matter their age. Teachers were sent home. Classrooms for girls were locked. Women were fired from offices, hospitals, aid groups, and shops. Even widows who depended on work to feed their children were suddenly left with nothing. Taliban patrols moved through neighborhoods, making sure women stayed inside. New rules were shouted through loudspeakers and written on walls. Women were ordered to wear full body coverings at all times and were banned from leaving home unless a close male relative walked beside them. Stepping outside alone was treated as a crime. These rules were enforced with fear, not warnings. The Taliban did not stop at big rules. They searched for the smallest mistakes to punish. One of the earliest punishments shocked Kabul. A woman was caught wearing nail polish. Taliban enforcers dragged her forward and cut off the tip of her thumb in public. There was no trial that people could understand, no mercy, and no way to appeal. It was meant to scare every woman watching or hearing about it, and it worked. Women shut their doors. Streets that once had mothers, daughters, and workers became empty. Armed men took their place, yelling orders and striking fear into entire families. Years later, in 2015, the world saw proof of how this violence never truly disappeared. A video emerged from Ghor province in central Afghanistan. It showed a young woman wearing a burqa, placed in a pit, surrounded by armed men. Stones were thrown at her head again and again. People stood nearby and watched. That woman was Roxana. She was only 19 years old. Taliban fighters accused her of having a relationship outside marriage. Her fiancé was beaten with 100 lashes and allowed to live. Roxana was sentenced to death. There was no real court, no lawyer, and no protection. Her screams echoed as stones struck her until she died. Afghan authorities had no control in that area, and no one stepped in to stop it. Reports later confirmed it was the first stoning captured on video since the Taliban were removed from power in 2001 after the US-led invasion. During that time, Afghan women felt something they had not felt in years. Schools reopened for girls. Women returned to offices, media, hospitals, and universities. A new generation grew up learning, working, and speaking in public, but the danger never fully disappeared. Taliban fighters retreated to rural areas and mountains. They did not abandon their beliefs. In places where government control was weak, they ran their own courts. These courts operated quietly but violently. Women knew this. They heard stories. They stayed careful. In 2012, one of these stories became impossible to ignore. In western Afghanistan, a 16-year-old girl and a young man were accused of adultery. Taliban-linked fighters publicly whipped them. After that, both were killed. The execution did not happen in a major city. It happened in an area where government forces had little reach. News spread fast anyway. People were horrified, but powerless. Afghan officials condemned the killings, but their words meant little on the ground. In many villages, local commanders acted as judge, jury, and executioner. A single accusation could end a life. Women learned that even during years of international presence, the old punishments could still return without warning. Then came August 2021. After 20 years of war, the Taliban returned to power almost overnight. Cities fell quickly. Kabul followed. Women who had grown up with education and jobs felt panic set in immediately. They remembered the 1990s. Within days, schools for girls were shut again. Women were told to stay home from work. Offices emptied. High schools closed their doors to female students. Government jobs were taken away from women, except for limited roles in health and education. Taliban fighters put up posters in the streets, telling women to stay inside and cover completely. Patrols returned. The fear returned with them. Women understood what this meant. But in late 2021, something rare happened in Afghanistan. Young women and teenage girls stepped into the streets instead of disappearing. Only weeks after the Taliban took power, small groups of women gathered in Kabul, Herat, Mazar-e Sharif, and other cities. They made their own signs using paper and markers from home. Many of them had never protested before. They were students, teachers, office workers, and daughters who had just lost their schools and jobs. They marched quietly at first, asking for the right to study, to work, and to exist in public. Under Taliban rule, women protesting openly was almost unheard of, which made these moments powerful and dangerous at the same time. The Taliban reacted fast and with violence. Armed fighters arrived in pickup trucks and blocked the streets. They did not try to talk or warn the women. Shots were fired into the air to scare them. Fighters rushed into the crowds and beat women with sticks, pipes, and rifle butts. Some used electric stun guns. Women fell to the ground as they tried to run. Journalists who were filming were also attacked, their cameras smashed, and some were beaten in front of everyone. Fear spread quickly. Many women were followed after the protests and later arrested at home. By October 2021, one protest ended in mass bloodshed when unarmed women and journalists were chased down and killed. Even after this, some women refused to stop. In Kabul, a small but determined group of activists formed what became known as the Women's Spontaneous Movement. These women met in secret. They changed locations often to avoid being tracked. They organized short sit-ins and marches focused on girls' education and basic rights. Each protest lasted only minutes because the risk was so high. The Taliban responded with growing anger. Security forces used tear gas to scatter women and fired blank rounds to terrorize them. Many protesters were identified through videos and photos shared online. Once identified, they became targets. On February 11, 2022, the crackdown reached a new level. Taliban forces stormed several safe houses where women activists were hiding. Hundreds of armed men arrived at once. They wore helmets and body armor. Some came with armored vehicles and tanks. Doors were smashed open. Inside were women, children, and family members who had nothing to do with protests. Everyone was beaten. Whips, batons, and fists were used without restraint. People were dragged outside and loaded into vehicles. They were taken to the Ministry of Interior for questioning. Inside detention, the abuse continued. Women were held for weeks without lawyers or contact with family. They were beaten again during interrogations. Some were shocked with electric cattle prods, while relatives were forced to watch. Food was limited, sleep was interrupted, confessions were forced, even when the women had committed no crime. The goal was not justice, it was humiliation and fear. This wave of arrests and violence spread panic. Hundreds of women activists went into hiding or fled their homes. Many deleted their social media accounts and destroyed protest signs and notes. Families begged daughters to stop speaking out, fearing arrest or death. International groups and Afghan officials outside the country began recording these abuses. Reports were written and warnings were issued. But inside Afghanistan, especially outside Kabul, the Taliban felt no pressure to stop. By 2022, fear had moved into every part of daily life for Afghan women. It was no longer only activists or protesters who were at risk. Ordinary women going to weddings, markets, or doctors now felt hunted. Taliban checkpoints appeared across Kabul and other cities. Armed fighters stopped cars and pedestrians without warning. A woman could be questioned, beaten, or detained in seconds. In January 2022, this fear became deadly. Zainab Abdullahi, a 25-year-old Hazara woman, was shot and killed at a Taliban checkpoint in Kabul. She had just returned from a wedding and was sitting in a vehicle when a Taliban fighter opened fire. Later, the fighter claimed it was a mistake. Zainab was dead. No one was punished. Her killing spread terror fast. Women across the city said they were now afraid to walk even during the day. The idea that a simple trip could end in death shattered any sense of safety. After Zainab's death, checkpoints became symbols of danger. Women without a male escort were often stopped and questioned. Some were slapped, dragged away, or locked up on the spot. Wearing a scarf too loosely or showing part of an ankle was enough to trigger abuse. International observers later reported that Taliban guards regularly harassed and beat women at checkpoints for clothing issues or for being alone. One woman's story shows how even small freedoms became dangerous. Diba was a 38-year-old tailor and a single mother living in Kabul. She worked from home, sewing men's clothes to support her child. She avoided trouble and kept a low profile. Still, the Taliban came for her. In 2024, she was stopped by a Vice and Virtue patrol for renting a sewing machine from a male shopkeeper. This was a normal business exchange. But Taliban officers accused her of immoral behavior. They insulted her, called her names, and jailed her for several days. The shopkeeper was punished too, and forced out of his store simply for serving her. Diba returned home shaken, but she still needed to survive. 3 months later, Diba was arrested again. There had been a power cut in her area, and she went to a cafe to charge her phone. She was alone and not fully covered. Taliban police grabbed her and accused her of insulting them and being outside without a male guardian. This time, she was held for 20 days in a crowded cell with 16 other women. They slept on dirty blankets on the floor. Food was scarce. Diba begged to call her sick daughter, but the guards ignored her. A Taliban judge later accused her of leaving home without permission and showing disrespect. Her punishment was 25 lashes. There was no appeal. Diba was not alone. Many women were arrested for small acts and forced to sign confessions they did not understand or agree with. Taliban courts moved fast and showed no mercy. Trials were often rushed or held in secret. In late 2022, the Taliban finally announced the return of public lashings. For the first time in more than 20 years, stadiums were used again as places of punishment. On November 23, 2022, Taliban authorities confirmed that 14 people, including 3 women, were whipped in a football stadium in eastern Afghanistan. The charges included adultery and theft. That same week, more people were lashed in another province. This was not a one-time act. It was the second public whipping in 1 month. Taliban leaders met with judges and urged them to enforce punishments strictly. The old system was back, openly and without shame. By December 2022, public lashings increased across the country. One of the most shocking took place in Charikar Stadium in Parwan province. Dozens of people were forced to kneel while armed fighters whipped them one by one. At least 27 people were punished that day. Reports later showed that since August 2021, the Taliban had carried out dozens of public punishments, almost all of them floggings. By 2023, women across Afghanistan knew the danger was growing, not fading. The rules were no longer just about clothing or movement. The fear now included the threat of extreme physical punishment. Since the Taliban returned to power, at least 136 women had been beaten in public. These are only the known cases. Many more women were beaten in homes, police stations, or detention centers where no records were kept, and no witnesses could speak safely. Despite the danger, some women refused to give up completely. Quiet resistance continued underground. Small groups of women documented arrests, floggings, and raids. They shared information in secret and kept records when they could. These women saw clearly that promises of change had meant nothing. They had watched groups of women punished together in public spaces, treated like objects rather than people. As international attention moved elsewhere, Afghan women felt increasingly abandoned. Support from outside grew weaker. The Taliban noticed this shift. Their leaders spoke more openly about bringing back even harsher punishments. In March 2024, Taliban leader Hibatullah Akhundzada announced that the harshest punishments under Taliban rule were officially back. Men and women accused of adultery would no longer face only lashings. They could now be stoned to death in public. It was said openly, through an audio message shared across Taliban-controlled areas. They believed no one could stop them anymore. There were no courts above them, no outside pressure they feared. The impact was immediate. Women understood their bodies had once again become targets in public places. Every walk outside felt dangerous. Every neighbor's stare carried risk. The Taliban framed these punishments as religious duty, but for women living under their rule, it felt like a warning to stay silent and invisible. Rights groups around the world reacted with alarm. They warned that Afghanistan was being pushed back into a time when fear ruled daily life. Inside the country, women did not need reports to understand this. They felt it in their homes. Only a few months later, those fears became reality. In June 2024, one of the largest public punishments in years took place in Saripul province. Taliban authorities gathered at least 63 people in a public space. Among them were 14 women. They were accused of crimes the Taliban labeled as immoral, including personal relationships outside marriage and theft. The punishment was carried out in a stadium. Thousands of people were forced to watch. One by one, the accused were whipped in full view of the crowd. Taliban officials confirmed the events themselves, treating it as proof of their control. For the women involved, the pain went beyond the physical lashes. Their names, bodies, and lives were exposed for public humiliation. The message was meant for everyone watching. International organizations quickly responded. They warned that these events were not isolated. They were part of a wider system being rebuilt step by step. Public punishments were becoming normal again. Behind the scenes, even darker decisions were being made. Taliban courts had already started issuing stoning sentences quietly. As early as mid-2023, internal records showed dozens of people had been sentenced to death by stoning for alleged adultery. These punishments were often planned in secret. Unlike public floggings, stonings did not always leave witnesses or evidence. Women knew this meant death could come at night, far from cameras or crowds. Even if only a few cases became known, the threat alone was enough to control millions of lives. The Taliban also revived brutal methods meant to kill without formal execution. One such punishment involved throwing or crushing the accused people behind walls. By mid to late 2024, reports showed just how widespread the violence had become. Taliban judges across different provinces ordered hundreds of public punishments in a single year. Dozens of these cases involved women. Many were punished not for proven crimes, but for accusations tied to family disputes, forced marriages, or simple defiance. By the time 2025 arrived, fear was no longer something new for Afghan women. It had settled into daily life. Public punishments became routine. In many provinces, people expected to see lashings announced the same way markets or prayers were announced. The Taliban continued to claim these punishments were lawful and fair, but for women living under them, the meaning was clear. One of the clearest examples came on November 17, 2025, in Zabul province. In the provincial capital, Kalat, Taliban forces ordered local residents to gather at a sports stadium. People were told to attend, not invited. Once the crowd formed, 9 accused individuals were brought forward. Among them were both men and women. Taliban officials said the charges were adultery and theft. The accused were forced to kneel on the ground. Taliban enforcers took turns whipping them in front of the crowd. Each strike was slow and deliberate. Children and families were present. No one was allowed to record openly, but the event still reached the outside world through witness reports and scattered social media posts. Throughout 2025, stories of women's suffering continued to surface despite heavy censorship. One case that shook many people involved a 17-year-old girl named Farkunda in Kabul. She had recently been married. Soon after, she was found dead under unclear circumstances. Taliban officials claimed she had taken her own life. Many women and activists doubted this explanation. Forced marriages were common. Domestic abuse was widespread. Investigations were rare. For many Afghan women, Farkunda's death felt familiar. Another young life lost, with no answers and no justice. What made these stories even heavier was the silence around them. In early years, such cases might have sparked international outrage. By 2025, attention had faded. Women activists said tragedies like Farkunda's were no longer surprising to the outside world. Inside Afghanistan, however, the pain was constant. Mothers feared for their daughters. Girls feared growing older. Marriage itself had become dangerous. The Taliban's system left women trapped with no safe way out.